Welcome to what I think is probably the most exciting session at the Global Technology Summit. It's, we did, as Shruti pointed out, we have been seeing a deployment of digital and technology weapons in the Russia-Ukraine war. My view is we actually had a preview of what the next generation war might look like. If you remember, not so long ago, the most recent conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and that in many ways, I would say, was a precursor to what we might be seeing, what we have been seeing for the last 8 months in the Russia-Ukraine theater. I have a panel which doesn't need introduction, but I will introduce them to you anyway. Ashley Tellis, Raj Shukla, Joshua White, and Lauren Kahn, who's joining in from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Lauren. Do yell out to us, but we do see you, and welcome. I'm going to begin with Ashley. Just because we always begin with Ashley. Ashley, we've brought back nuclear threats in the Russia war. We in this subcontinent are no stranger to nuclear threats. We've lived with them for decades, and but how concerned would you be, or are you, about escalation, nuclear escalation, and we've seen this play out over the last couple of months. So how concerned would you be about this?
So thanks, Indrani. Before I address the issue of concern itself, let me make a couple of points that bear on the answer that I want to offer you. I think the Russia-Ukraine conflict has been a rude reminder for the entire international community that nuclear weapons still matter. After the end of the Cold War, the central nuclear competition had receded into people's consciousness. And as recently as a few years ago, President Obama was actually emboldened to think in terms of a world without nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. I think what this conflict has done is that it has shown that nuclear weapons have never really left center stage, even if they were somewhat recessed. Now, having said that, there are 2 or 3 dimensions of nuclear interactions that I think are worth flagging. The first lesson that I think vulnerable states will take away from this crisis is that you cannot do without nuclear weapons. And if you are a state like North Korea or Iran, the argument for giving up your nascent nuclear capabilities becomes less and less attractive as a result of what has happened in Ukraine. In other words, the challenges for non-proliferation have simply gotten magnified because people will draw the conclusion that a state that was imprudent enough, as Ukraine was, to give up its nuclear weapons, is now paying the price for that strategic decision. Now, obviously, there were many factors that bore on the issue at the time of the signing of the Budapest Memorandum and the great power guarantees that were offered to Ukraine for its security and so on and so forth. But the bottom line is, when you abstract from all the details, people are simply going to say, those documents matter less. The fact that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons have now put it in this position of great vulnerability. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, and this is far more troubling, is that what we've seen in Russia's use of nuclear threats is a remarkably blatant form of nuclear blackmail. And it's another way of driving home the point that if you possess nuclear weapons, and if you are a willful state willing to manipulate the threats of their use, you can get away with a lot. And you see that because in the Biden administration's response to Ukraine, for example, one of the central drivers that has shaped US response has been the fear of escalation. The manner in which we have supported Ukraine has been very sensitive to the question of thresholds, very sensitive to minimizing the damage that Ukraine could do on strategic Russian assets. And all these factors are driven by the fear that if you push the Russians to the wall, we might end up with a nuclear conflict to which we will become party whether we like it or not. So the fact that the Russians have now demonstrated that nuclear coercion pays off in the sense that you can shape the responses of both adversaries and bystanders in a way that advances your core political interests, I think is actually a rather unsettling lesson that this crisis is going to leave for the international community.
Thank you for saying that. Just as a reminder, after Gaddafi was killed, I think we had a conversation between Iranian leaders and Indian, and that was one of the reasons they gave for never giving up their nuclear weapons. So to buttress what you just said. But you are watching what you were watching in Ukraine, and the use of technology. How do you see that playing out in developing war-fighting strategies, war-fighting concepts by militaries? And you've been a student of this for many years.
When people ask me that question, and it's an obvious question that is asked because of the severity of the crisis, I'm reminded of the apocryphal tale, Juan Lau's comment on the French Revolution, too early to tell.
Too early
right?
to tell.
Because we are still watching this in slow motion, sort of evolve before our eyes. And there are so many dimensions of the question. I mean, there's a strategic dimension, there's an operational dimension, there's a tactical dimension. Let me just say a few words about the operational dimension, because that, I think, comes closest to addressing the question you asked, which is what are the lessons, for military forces as they go along. And let me offer 4 thoughts that I think are worth thinking about. The first is the exotic capabilities that we think about, cyber and so on and so forth, have clearly made a difference, but they have not displaced the primacy of heavy metal in war. This is something to keep in mind, because one of the things that we've realized, particularly when we think of these exotic instrumentalities, is the fragility of the instrumentality. That is, cyber operations, for example, work splendidly when your networks are unprotected. But if you have protected and resilient networks, actually it is not clear to me that they can produce strategic effects. And any military worth the name, or any government worth the name, if it doesn't attend to the business of protecting its networks, then, it shouldn't be in the warfighting business to begin with, right? So in our focus on the exotic, we should not lose sight of the prosaic. So heavy metal matters. The sort of normal accoutrement of warfare has not gone out of style. It makes a huge difference. The second thing that I would flag is the absolute importance of ISR. You cannot fight an effective campaign if you do not know what is on the other side of the hill. And this is where I think new technologies have made a huge difference with respect to collection, more importantly with respect to fusion, because you have diverse sensors which are picking up signatures, with using multiple sort of phenomenologies. But to be able to fuse that information and provide it to the operator in a relatively quick, at a relatively quick pace, so as to enable the operators to then deliver firepower on targets, literally sometimes in a matter of seconds, right? So US ISR systems, the Ukrainian ISR systems are able to identify very small and discrete targets like Russian artillery batteries, even if they are mobile. Identify the geocoordinates of those batteries, cycle that data in machine-readable form to the firing batteries, which are 40, 50 kilometers behind the line. And these batteries are then able to fire salvos, literally in an operating cycle that can be measured in seconds. So ISR has a huge impact. And, one cannot afford to shortchange ISR investments, even at the expense of sort of pointy instruments. The third point that I think is really interesting is that precision-guided weapons are extremely expensive, but in the long run, they're turning out to be far more economical. Because even though the upfront unit cost per weapon is much higher than a dumb weapon, the fact that you use so little of them to actually produce operationally relevant effects has a huge economy. And then the last point I'll make is that this war has shown us that munitions disappear faster than anyone imagines. And so the old adage that, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics, really hits you in the face. Because modern warfare is a consumption-intensive form of engagement. And the amount of money you have to put in maintaining a long and robust logistics tail is something that this war has shown us. And it's not just shown us for Ukraine, it's actually shown us for the United States, because the US has taken responsibility for supporting the Ukrainians with various forms of, kit. And so you cannot afford to forget about the things that nobody sees, which are things in your inventory, things in your, storage facilities, and so on and so forth. So.
Thank you, Ashley. It's interesting you spoke about inventories and munitions. Raj, you will, of course, wear your military hat. But my question to you is, what are the lessons that the Indian military has taken in terms of technological leapfrogging from the Russia-Ukraine war, not about the veracity of Russian weapons or the greatness or otherwise of their military strategy, but just on the pure part of technology, the role that technology has played, and what does that mean for us, for the military, for the Indian military?
Before that, Indrani, if I may just make a quick point on the nuclear transitions that Ashley was talking about. I just want to make 2 to 3 quick points, and that is one, at one time the nuclear debate in India was very deep and rich. Over the last decade, it has somehow been pushed to the periphery. And it is my view that we must revisit the parameters of that debate, because given the sophistication of the Chinese nuclear arsenal, in things like tonnages, precisionary, hypersonic vector through FOBS, the fact it's my understanding they have a strategic nuclear force which is signaling to the to the US mainland, and a tactical nuclear force which is signaling to the LAC and the bases around. These aspects need to be revisited in great depth. Simplistic dismissals that tactical nuclear weapons are not required or they won't work may not be true. That's just one point I wanted to make. Now, returning to technology, though the lessons from Ukraine are mixed, in fact, the lessons of Ukraine are that technological sophistry is very important, but it cannot be at the cost of basic readiness. In fact, the principal lesson is how this great Russian military unraveled as a military instrument because it lacked readiness. So before I come to technology, I just want to make this one point, or these 2 points, that what Ukraine does, it has shown fresh light on where the instrument of force should be in your power calculus, in your strategic calculus. So to me, it seems that because these norms of territorial conquest have been breached, the instrument of force is returning to the center of the power calculus. 1. And 2, if it returns to the center of the power calculus, creating an instrument of force which is ready, and in a very high state of readiness, and a war-winning instrument. Now, that is a huge challenge. I'll just, elaborate with one small example. The Indian military, it's very obvious now for decades, it needs to be joint, it needs to be technologically enabled, it needs to be calibrated, which means optimized, and it needs to be ready. Now, each is a one-word descriptor, but look at the time these things take. We've been struggling with jointness for the last 30 years. And in the meantime, what's happened, even as we are debating, theater commands, which are really structural corrections, today you need to set up digital theaters. So this is how these things are happening. Look at readiness. in the manner that the Russian military has. So these are the 2 points. I'm just coming to technology. Let me first speak about the Indian Army.
All right.
So the Air Force and the Navy, at least in the public perception, and perhaps rightly so, were supposed to be the leaders in technology, and the Indian Army was some kind of a laggard. But over the last 5 to 6 years, I think thanks to General Rawat, General Saha, and a host of others, major steps have been taken so as to, shall I say, in the Indian military, to get this whole technology thing going. So things like outreach to, academia, IITs, the private sector, startups. It was unheard of when I was young that startups would come, but they are here. In fact, one of the first well-known startups, drone swarming, which has been done by Samir Joshi, was a thing given by the Indian Army. Having said that, the challenges of technology are so much. So let me give you one example. While all the things have got going, look at Ukraine. The precisionary was the dominant theme, and it was being challenged by EW. Now here we must learn from the Chinese. They have this rocket force, which is a very sophisticated ecosystem of precision strike, and the SSF, which combines space, cyber, and EW. And if in thought they are so many years ahead of us, look at the Indian challenge. We haven't yet set up a rocket force, and we haven't yet really, done something about EW. So while these baby steps have been taken, a lot is being done. I'll just wind this technology argument with 2 aspects. I'll paraphrase the Prime Minister. When he talks about Atmanirbharta, it's not merely an empty slogan of self-reliance. He says that the forces of innovation, energy, enterprise must be released from the scourge of process and procedure. So this is where technology is stuck. Trying to align it with an outdated DPP, it just won't work. So these things are happening, but they need to pick up space. So I would say that in a lot of this stuff like digital combat, loiter, ISR, these things have got going, but we really have to step it up. Gati Shakti, speed and scale, that really needs to happen, and that is the challenge about us. And just one last point, look at this whole challenge, about just look at how the character of war has been upended. In India, we were saying the days of all-out conflict are over. Are they? In India, we were talking about, it had almost got into our bloodstream. कि लड़ाई नहीं होने वाली, लड़ाई हो रही है. So these kind of issues, have this business of short, swift conflict. It's been drilled into every army officer, short, swift conflict. So we thought, Pakistan army 8 to 10 days, really? 9 months. So we have to visit a lot of these paradigms about the character of war, logistics sustainment. People were questioning whether 40I was excessive. And as Ashley tells us, 90I have proved to be inadequate. And look at how, just one last example and wind up. In the first 2 months, the Ukraine artillery and the Russian artillery were perhaps equal in terms of strikes, counter-strikes, because of the ammunition availability. And then Ukrainian stocks went down. And not one country in NATO could rejig those stocks in time. So logistics sustainment, industrial capacity, whole lot of challenges. These are the lessons from the Ukraine conflict.
So we, of course, have a very singular lesson from the Ukraine war, given our dependence on Russia. But something that you spoke about on the nuclear front, and how we thought that the nuclear debate has been behind us. I think partly Ashley is to blame, because after the nuclear deal, we all thought that was behind us.
He didn't write a book for a long time.
It's all on him. And but the second is, and I noticed how when the Pakistanis developed their own TNWs, the Nasser, for instance, and we, in many ways, the discourse in India dismissed it as, in quotes, the jihadi edge to their nuclear arsenal. But it's clearly a lot more than that. And I think one of the things that the Ukraine war has shown is how we dropped that particular debate just by putting it into a different box. But you talked about fusion, and it's not only China's civil military fusion that we should look to, but where does the Indian military get its technology? Government is famously skeptical of the private sector. Technological advancements, you talked about the startups. The technological advancements are coming out of these startups. How responsive or how open is the Indian defense establishment to incorporating new ideas, new technologies into the Indian military, tailored to the Indian military situation? How are you working on this?
So see, there are two aspects to it. One is that the traditional organs like the DRDO and the DPSUs, they need to smarten up greatly to give us our technological requirements. So that is happening in some measure. The TDF program of the DRDO is being looked into. We've had some revamping of the DPSUs, most notably the OF. See a good example, the ordnance factories, they are these massive ammunition behemoths, but what are they producing? Dumb munitions. And the central lesson of Ukraine is actually brought out is not going. You have to be imaginative even in ammunition. So things like loiter, all this kind of stuff, smart munitions. So, and therefore now the Indian military is looking to the private sector and the startups precisely because the private sector and startups are supposed to bring to the table issues like innovation, creativity, energy, enterprise. So I would say the wariness of the past has gone. We have turned to them, but it needs to pick up. And, I would just want to connect with yesterday's orders. See what's happening in the Indian context, two issues. There was a whole lot of talk of how to create policy incentives. Now, we spend so much time in creating policy incentives that a better way, the best way to give incentives is to place orders. There is nothing like that. I'll give you an example of the Samir Joshi. So when we swarmed these drones with him, he was the only guy in India with a swarming algorithm. By the time we got to the second stage of orders, third stage of orders, there were 12, 14 guys. So nothing like orders. They are best incentives. So that culture of civil-military fusion has to grow. And not only, it has to come from the humility where you acknowledge that national security today is so complex that no single institution can do it on its own. Now, I can vouch for the senior leadership of the Indian Army. It does realize this. We do realize we need new talent pipelines in these niche areas like space, EW, cyber, new career mobility pathways. Now, all this there is a realization, but it's going to take, time to execute. But one thing is clear. I've now heard the Honorable Raksha Mantri talk about it, the Honorable Foreign Minister talk about it. So the lexicon is picking up of civil-military fusion. So a lot of things can happen. For example, in today's day and age, why shouldn't the Ministry of Defense not be cross-pollinated? Cross-pollinated in terms of expertise, domain expertise, analysts. All this stuff is happening. It should happen. It's happening in some other ministries. It should pick up. And so really, what has happened, while we are still debating jointness and integration, I would say the debate has moved well past. It's now cross-pollination, civil-military fusion. It's China, Israel, US, Turkey. So it just has to happen in our case. So I would just sum it up by saying that the wariness of the past is behind us. We are turning to it. By the way, the Indian Army has done a lot of work with startups. R&D. When I was GOC in R-Track, about 25 crores to R&D. All has gone to these small startups and all that. But the scale needs to pick up.
Right. Lauren, may I come to you? Because Raj talked about new talent pipelines. And a lot of the new talent pipelines comes from the new technologies of AI and other emerging technologies. You've been looking at that very closely. In the context of the Ukraine war, what are the lessons that you saw, and how should we think about this going forward?
Absolutely. Thank you. My co-panelists bring up great points. I will caveat that while we're here talking about technology, technology is not a silver bullet. And I'll divide some of these technologies that we've spoken about mainly into three buckets, I'll say, where we have technologies that we've had for a longer period of time and we've used and that have been used in conflicts such as drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, but that are being used in innovative and newer ways. And then you've got a bucket of technologies that are a little bit further along in their development, such as loitering munitions, where we've seen also previously in conflicts, but not as commonly, and that are really kind of being used en masse for the first times in Russia and Ukraine. Finally, I'll say there's this cohort of really emergent and new technologies, like artificial intelligence in particular, that are very, very young, that are really only being used in very narrow applications, I will say, on the battlefield for the first times. And so I think a lot of this is happening and disrupting things and changing, because you're seeing innovation, not in itself of the technologies, but also how they're being used in general. States in the United States and Russia and China have all been speaking about these technologies for a longer period of time and have, emphasized that they're investing in these emerging technologies. But I'll say what Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine and the use and reliance of technologies and precision and more of these emerging capabilities has really condensed some of those timelines, I think, for other states that are looking and watching, that thought they had a few, 5, 10, 15 years before some of these technologies that we were going to be seeing. I think a really good example, loitering munitions. The United States, for example, was able to fast track the Phoenix Ghost munition, which wasn't even ready to be deployed for the first time in Ukraine. So again, we're seeing this increase in movement. And a lot of this, I think, is because these technologies are very different in that they're commercially based largely, or largely emerging from the private and academic sectors, and are not necessarily, the basic research is not necessarily military in nature. And so a lot of the development and such is required to a lot closer collaboration with the private sector that we've seen in the past, which is posing numerous issues in terms of attaining that civil military fusion. And I'll also say it causes a few unique kind of quirks and challenges when it comes to regulating and kind of putting controls on the use of these technologies. In particular, when it comes to software, I think, putting export controls and how are they used when you by nature have these technologies that are supposed to be used in new and different ways. I think that's posing really unique challenges. So I think it's just the first kind of glimpses that we're seeing of this new kind of trend in warfare in general. Again, I will say that technology is not a silver bullet, and it's not going to be the end-all be-all and don't in it of itself constitute revolutions. However, the increased accessibility of these technologies, how cheap that they are. For example, some of these Iranian loitering munitions that were used a few weeks ago, while it cost Russia only about 18 million to launch a wave of the drone attacks, it costs about 28 million, one estimate said, to shoot them down. And so even if, they're not necessarily that technically successful, Ukraine was able to shoot them down at an extremely high rate because of the cost effectiveness. They're becoming a lot more useful and a lot less precious. And we're seeing that in general with some of these technologies, which is leading to more innovative uses and applications of them.
Thank you. That is a question that you always have to look at the flip side of this. And, I've just come from the fact that everybody looks at civil-military fusion as a good thing. 6 months ago, we were saying civil-military fusion was a bad thing, which is what the Chinese were doing to everybody else. But that's a different matter. So, but that leads me to my question. What's the point? Or how do we decide the point when technology is not used as not merely an instrument of war, but goes well beyond that to cause the kind of global instability that we ought to fear?
Absolutely. I think it's going to be increasingly challenging. I think a prime example is cyber and the emergence of, volunteer hacker armies in Ukraine, where right now they're being lauded as a very interesting way for individuals to kind of be involved directly in the fighting. However, long term, it's not really sustainable and almost removes the monopoly on the use of force from states. It gets to be a little bit out of hand, right? The classic issue of a vigilante and being able to control it. I think that will continue to be a challenge and will grow. especially when it comes to, again, artificial intelligence and software, where largely the technologies, again, can be as harmless as I'm sure many of you have played with the DALL-E 2 image generating services or GP2-3, these large language processing and image generation models that seem harmless at first glance. And, once they're out there, they're open source and anyone can develop them and use them for their own purposes. I think it's very hard to put controls on the end user and how they'll be applied and, again, used in potentially military contexts or terroristic contexts. And so there has to be a lot more self-regulation on the part of companies and individuals who are putting out this work, which is going to be challenging. And then as a result, it has to be a lot more work with governments to kind of put regulations on how will these be used institutionally. I think a potential way forward that I'm a large advocate for are confidence building measures, which are not binding but are sort of building blocks to put in place to increase transparency between countries and within countries themselves as well, to kind of start to make moves on regulation and to start controlling the possible use cases preemptively without, putting constraints on innovation, of course, but in order to sort of get some established baseline and norms and understanding of what's acceptable or what to do when inevitably crises arise or unintended uses of some of these technologies. And so I think I don't have a good answer for how to fix it, but I think states need to, looking at this crisis and looking at this conflict ongoing, are going to need to start thinking about these things more seriously and about, international cooperation on some of these fronts.
Thanks. Frankly, I'm not holding my breath for states to find ways to regulate this, but I'm going to move to our last speaker, Joshua. What would be your top 3 lessons that you learned from the war in Ukraine? I mean, we've all gone through the technology and everything, but what were the big lessons that you learned?
Thanks. I want to begin by building on something that Ashley said. I think there's an understandable impulse to say, or to ask yourself, which technologies or platforms performed well and which ones performed poorly. But in many ways, for me, in looking at the kind of stories that we're telling ourselves about success and failure, the value of what you might call force integration is so important in this conflict. That is the use of combined arms, joint operations and planning, and sort of integrated information operations. So if you think, what are the stories about failure that we're hearing? Oh, well, tanks aren't relevant anymore because look how many tanks have been destroyed. Well, that's really a story about the failure of combined arms, about bringing together armor and artillery and surveillance in order to protect that sort of ecosystem in which the tank operates. Right? Or the story that we can no longer protect these large capital ships at sea from these, robotic kayaks filled with explosives. Well, that's a story of a failure to create a layered defense with aerial surveillance and other kinds of defenses to protect these large assets, right? And then if you think about the stories of successes, what has really worked? Well, drones have been very important in this conflict. And they've been important, I think, largely with these cheap, attritable drones that are expendable, but that allow you to acquire targets quickly and then feed them into the system to get that information to the person who needs it very, very quickly. There have also been some fascinating public reports about the way in which the Ukrainian military has gathered information from all kinds of sources, including locals in villages texting the government about the movement of Russian forces, feed that into a database, and then send those maps, really, to commanders right on the front lines in ways that most militaries are frankly very uncomfortable with, not siloing that secret information, but sending it to many people on the front lines. And that's enabled a kind of responsive movement that is really, I think, quite important and profound. So I think a lot of examples that we have already seen and will see in this conflict, in which integrating forces in this way and thinking about the integration of the information environment is really what has been most consequential in allowing the Ukrainian forces to operate with new kinds of technologies. The second thing I would say is maybe an older lesson, at least 100 years old, which is that there is really no substitute for layered defenses in depth with logistics, multiple lines of logistics and communications. And we haven't looked at the full story of how things have unfolded in this conflict, but it does seem to be that the Russian forces were able to advance much more quickly and were able to hold territory in areas where the Ukrainians simply did not have layered defenses already prepared, did not have multiple logistic lines available. And in areas where the Ukrainians had prepared in that manner, it's been much more difficult for the Russian forces. So we've known this for a long time. This is something that I think, if you look at the LAC, the Indian system is certainly well aware of, but has also been, I think, rather slow and is catching up to the need to invest very significant logistics in infrastructure to build that defense in depth. It's just hugely important lesson, a classic lesson from this conflict. And third is a lesson that I think has already been part of this conversation, which is the importance of developing your own technology. There's a big push, a very important push here in India for indigenizing technology, including defense technology. And I think that will play a role in India's success or failure in future conflicts. Here, I do worry a little bit that the Indian system might draw slightly the wrong lesson, in that it might, what I see happening is a push to indigenize without prioritize, right? Without prioritizing what are the areas in which India might have real comparative advantages, where it should invest what are actually limited capital resources to build a unique set of capabilities. And those decisions about what do we buy off the shelf, where do we work with partners like the United States or others, many others, and where do we really double down on our own capabilities to develop something special here? If that kind of prioritization doesn't happen in the conversation about defense indigenization, India will end up doing lots of things very poorly, and its net capabilities that it brings to a fight will actually degrade over time rather than improve. And that's not something, as a friend of India, I want to see, but I think that is really, in many ways, the challenge, not just mobilizing funds, but where to focus those funds, where India has that comparative advantage, and where to work with partners, and where to buy off the shelf. That, I think, is the critical technology procurement challenge for the next 5 and 10 years.
So, since you have been sort of studying the Indian defense strategy for a very long time, I wanted to ask you this in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war and the lessons that you spoke about. We have a dual front challenge, in the sense that we have a maritime challenge, we have a continental challenge. And you just spoke about prioritizing, and of course I honestly can't see how we prioritize between the LAC and the Indian Ocean. So if Indian, not just defense strategy, but also a defense procurement, or thinking about beyond the horizon kind of challenges, how would we prioritize? Where do we go?
No, it's a really important question, and I think I've gone back and forth on this in my own thinking a little bit. It seems to me, if you look at what we have already seen the Chinese forces do along the LAC, there really is, in my mind, a strong case for focusing on that continental border as a matter of priority. And I think we've seen the challenges that India faced along the LAC, even in an environment in which Pakistan did not undertake diversionary military activity along the LAC or the international boundary, which it could easily have done at very low cost to itself, in a way that would have complicated life for the Indian defense planners quite, to a considerable degree. So I think, and then at the same time on the maritime theater, there are real challenges. We see the PLA Navy encroaching quite significantly into the Indian Ocean, but it will be a couple of decades before the Chinese Navy can begin to overcome its deep, logistical and geographic challenges, insecurities that it faces, vulnerabilities that it faces in the Indian Ocean. So what would I do? I mean, shorthand, I think a few things. One is take some of these lessons from the Ukraine conflict. Focus very significantly on building out the distributed sensing network along the continental border, from the attritable cheap ISR to and drones, to the more sophisticated drone networks, to having a battlefield command system that can work well with dispersed forces. And that kind of sensor network, I think, is just going to be hugely important. The second is what India is already, I think, catching up and trying to do is invest in the layered defenses, the infrastructure that is expensive but simply vital to being able to defend in depth. And build some of these kind of systems. And then third, as both of you wisely said, invest in a lot of munitions, because it's expensive now, but everyone would like a short conflict. Who wouldn't want a short conflict if you think you can prevail and have advantages in a short conflict? But if you count on a short conflict, you could really be in trouble. And then I would just say finally, what does that mean for the maritime theater? Well, the maritime theater is still very important, but I'm not convinced that another aircraft carrier is the best use of funds. I think there are ways to focus on maritime domain awareness and invest in standoff cruise missiles in ways that really make life complicated for the PLA Navy, but in more asymmetric ways that don't require the same kind of capital expenses or prestige platforms that the Indian defense establishment seems to prioritize.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give four of you very short interventions before I open up to questions from the floor. If you have comments on your co-panelists' interventions. Raj, I know you had a...
I'll just make two quick points. One is whether technology is a silver bullet or not. So Chris Miller has reminded us very eloquently in his book that the Soviet military atrophied because of its inability to miniaturize computing power in the Cold War. Putin decides to restore Russian power on the back of the Russian military, and he invests in all kinds of glamorous capacities, but makes one critical mistake: no investments in semiconductors. And look at the RUSI report, which tells us about 30 military systems, 450 components, no precisionary, correct, and right from radios to kill chains to missiles, it affects every component. And so you see declining effectiveness of the Russian military from the time the squeeze has been applied on the semiconductors. So I mean, technology is a silver bullet. The second point is, just very quickly about prioritization. Now, while budgets are of course a factor, and budgets are most welcome, there is one thing I would like to throw up, and that is, this also the lesson from Ukraine, but the larger utility of asymmetric balancing. So look at Russia. When the war started, its budgetary spend was 10 times, tanks was 6 times. Look at China, US. The American defense budget is about 3.5 to 4 times of the Chinese budget. But because of all the reforms that they have carried out in jointness, innovation, fusion, why is it the Chinese, evolution of the military is causing displacement anxiety in Pentagon, while within similar budgetary differentials, the Indian military does not cause similar anxieties in Beijing? So therefore, technology is important, concomitant reforms are important, and while the LAC is very important and operational rebalancing will reduce Chinese options, we need to seriously take our unifocal ambitions beyond the LAC. And that would perhaps be a tool to asymmetrically balance China.
Good point. Thank you. Ashley, yours. But I'd also, if you would like to just also look at, since you're, understand China very well, what's the lesson that they draw? What's the lesson that Beijing drew from this?
So let me say a couple of things. I want to endorse the point that Lauren made, that an excessive focus on technology can actually be distorting from the point of view of policymaking. Because military effectiveness is a very complex function of how you synergize diverse capabilities and bring it to bear in support of very complex operations. And so when you think of one piece of technology and sort of fetishize it, you could end up making very serious mistakes. And the Iraqi experience in operation in the 2 wars that we fought against Iraq is really a classic example of this, where if you rack and stack specific Iraqi capabilities, they looked very, very impressive. The technology was cutting edge and so on and so forth. But when it came to actually utilizing these technologies in a synergistic way, they proved terribly wanting. And so you could defeat a large and, a force that had a huge inventory with a much smaller capability that was much more efficient and organized and so on and so forth. Second thing is we have to pay attention to operational context when you think about specific technologies. And drone warfare is a very good example. So there is now a temptation to see after what the Russians did with Iranian drones, as somehow this is the new magic bullet, right? I would wager a considerable portion of my income that if you put those drones to work against an adversary that had an effective air defense system, the survival rate of those drones would be minuscule. And so there is a context which allows some of these systems to appear efficient, and you want to be very careful about what you infer from those lessons, right? What was the second question you asked me? I'm sorry about. On the Chinese. So first, again, I think on this issue more than any other, we don't know what the Chinese lessons are. But I would flag 2 or 3 things based on conversations with Chinese colleagues. And they are all terribly, terribly insightful. The first thing I think they have learned from this conflict is the central importance of sound civil-military relations. That is, you cannot make decisions to go to war if you have a military that's lying to the civilian leadership or a civilian leadership that fails to appreciate what the military strengths and weaknesses are. I think this is like, sort of lesson number 1. Lesson number 2 is that your pre-war assessments of your own capability rarely survive contact with the enemy. And so you have to be extremely prudent before you make big decisions about going to war. And for the Chinese, the specific implication is that if you are going to be engaged in combat in media where you do not have a natural proficiency, or where the adversary has terrific benefits of either geography or so on and so forth, then the decisions about war and peace have to be even more carefully calibrated. You cannot afford to make these decisions on a whim, right? And then I think the third thing that they would pay attention to is simply the importance of operational proficiency, because the Russians turned out to be a paper army. It's a good question to ask whether the PLA, for all the advances in kit that we've seen over the last 20 years, might not suffer the same sorts of disabilities. When have they last fought a modern mechanized war? Forget about an informatized war, an intelligence, whatever the terms of art are, right? So when has the PLA ever engaged in large-scale naval or air operations against even a semi-confident, adversary on the other end? So if anything, I think what the Ukraine conflict has done is that it has, at least in the China-Taiwan context and in the China-US context, actually been extremely an important contribution to deterrence, because it has shown them how complicated war is, how you cannot take things for granted, and how you have to be really careful if you're going up against a competent adversary. And I think that is all to the good from the point of view of stability.
Right. Lauren, do you have a comment on any of your co-panelists' interventions?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to really emphasize that point that Raj made about synergies, and that technology is a tool that needs to be used in a broader context and really integrated, and not treated in a vacuum when using it with forces or to use it effectively. I think, from the United States perspective, a lot of the discussion about the US technological leadership and readiness on some of these capabilities, like artificial intelligence in particular, is viewed largely in contrast to Chinese advancements and Chinese statements and their work in these areas and their emphasis that they're placing on emerging technologies. I think the lesson that we're learning from Ukraine and in general is that, despite stated intentions, I think China has argued that it wants an intelligentized PLA that, combines cyber with kinetic warfare that is AI enabled and quantum computing enabled, but that it's really hard to do all of those things at once, and that is going to be the key moving forward.
Thank you. Before I turn to Joshua, take questions. If you no, hang on. Just if you could just make your way to the nearest mic and just stand there, I will call on you. Joshua, do you have anything to say, or should I?
Just very, very briefly, I think it's important to remember that Ukraine has fought valiantly and impressively. It has not fought by itself. It has been enabled by a very deep network of partners providing arms and ammunition and intelligence. I mean, as somebody who has some experience with the U.S. defense system, it is just stunning to watch how quickly the United States Defense Department, which does not always move quickly, has been able to scrounge equipment, move equipment to the front lines, and help a partner whose sovereignty was violated. And I think there will be many stories to be told over the coming years that will come out about how the United States and its partners enabled in real time feeding targeting information and other operational and tactical insights to the Ukrainians in a way that enabled them to be their most integrated and operationally effective forces. So that sort of partner story is an important part of the Ukraine story. And also, I think as India thinks about the kinds of conflicts it might have, the kinds of friends it might have in those conflicts, and the capabilities that those friends might be willing to bring to bear in terms of equipment and that sort of behind-the-scenes intelligence support, which has proved just vital in this case.
Thank you. The gentleman there, short question. We only have 12 minutes, so really short and pointed,
Hi, good morning. I'm Gaurav. I'm a GTS Young Ambassador from Indian School of Public Policy. My question is to Lieutenant General Raj Shukla. Like, in the past 75 years, we don't have a single national security strategy, and US revises it every year and then. So where are we progressing on that front?
Thank you. I'll take a couple of questions. Is that okay?
So I'm Sanyogita.
You'll have to speak up, my dear.
So I'm Sanyogita. I'm GTS Young Ambassador representing Kautilya School of Public Policy. So this question comes from a limited understanding of mine. So when we think of technology, we always think unilateral progress or unidirectional progress of technology. But as we were discussing, like how we progress from sort of conventional weapons to nuclear and to cyber, but we see now that we have to go back and strengthen our old technologies or conventional technologies. So do you think that geopolitical compulsions and the agencies involved sort of takes us away from this thought of unidirectional progress?
Do you have that directed against any particular
no,
panelist or anybody? Okay. Would you like to, Raj, I think there was one question to you. Lauren, would you like to take the second question?
Sure.
Okay. Raj?
I mean, so I would agree with you that we are not as diligent as the Americans are in churning out these strategies, national defense strategy, national security. It would be a very good thing that we do. But yet, may I point out that it does not mean that there is an absence of a thought. So, I mean, you have all these services have the biennial Army Commanders Conferences, combined commanders conferences. The last one, the Prime Minister spent 9 hours. The Defense Minister spent 48 hours. So these things are debated. The services know what they wish to do. They are in our heads. They have also evolved into certain plans. And therefore, all these steps have been taken. For example, CDS, DMA, you saw those new normals in our strategic outlook. Atmanirbharta fronts, startups, all these things are happening. What the outcomes will tell you that there is thought. There is a certain, I would say, intellectual churn which is on, so that we keep pace with what is happening. Were we to turn it into a strategy document, it would be that much better. I hope I'm not evading that question, but that's
Thank you. Laura, would you like to take the second question about the unidimensional, linear progression of technology?
Great. So I love this question because I think we fall into this trap where you see technology as, what very linear in progression, as you mentioned. I think there's a technology life cycle, as we're seeing with a lot of these technologies, where you have ups and downs, and you have these certain moments where there's a lot of interest and then it falls off, and as progresses in the technology advance, it might launch a boom. I think as someone who focuses on artificial intelligence, I think artificial intelligence has a unique story when it comes to these sorts of questions. In the 1950s, there was a lot of really intense research going on and a lot of excitement about the potential. And that potential continued into the 70s, where you got, the expectations did not live up to the reality did not really live up to the expectations and the hype. And so you had what were called AI winters, where you had almost no funding. And now we're in, you've had that happen twice already. And now you have another AI spring, is what often individuals are calling this kind of period now, where you have breakthroughs in machine learning and natural language processing and computer vision that are leading to, breakthroughs and this resurgence in interest. And so I think treating it like that, and I think coming from the United States in particular, really needs to shift to thinking about that mindset where technology progress is not, the next thing is not better than the previous iteration. You have to think about how technologies fit into existing systems and actually can facilitate interoperability and, can enhance existing capabilities. I know a lot of the conversations have been, now's the time for the drone and say goodbye to the tank. But no, It's just creating roles for these and enhancing them.
Okay. Joshua, quick one.
Yeah, I just had to say something about the national security strategy. As a professor, I would love to see India develop a national security strategy, because professors love to compare the buzzwords in one strategy against the buzzwords in the next strategy. As a former US government official, I'd say I'm not sure you should bother creating a public national security strategy, because strategies are, if they're going to be useful, they are about setting priorities and making trade-offs and having a document that can then be used by the system and referenced by the system to justify those trade-offs. And you simply can't do that in an effective way in a public strategy.
Right. Thank you. The gentleman here.
Hi. Hello.
Quick.
Hi. Good
Really
morning. I'm Rahul Banerjee, and I'm the managing director at Rice & House. So something that we tend to focus on is perception warfare. And as we have seen in Afghanistan, we regularly see in Kashmir Valley, as now in Ukraine. What would be the role of big tech companies like Twitter and Facebook in the future of warfare?
Thank you. Good question.
Hello, my name is Riju Sachdev. I'm a GTS Young Ambassador from IIIT Bangalore. So my question is directed to Ms. Tellis. So sir, you spoke about how encryption is now being used to make sure that the data is safe and secure, and it shouldn't be under threat from a foreign entity, right? But even the NSA was hacked by the shadow brokers in 2016, 2017. So with a situation like that, I mean, how realistic do you think it is to assume that, I know India hasn't been hacked yet, but how realistic do you think it is to assume that we won't be hacked in the future?
Thank you. I'll take the last question. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Prerna. I'm an assistant director at Ananta Aspen Center. This is for the panel, whoever wants to take it. I want to connect the points made by Ashley and Joshua at one point, synergizing diverse capabilities and having to rely on external parties for certain capabilities. Could the panel speak to fortifying the energy sector in Ukraine? Now, very specifically, we know that Russia has been physically attacking the infrastructure. They were not as successful in the cyber attack, at least back in April. For that, the crucial role was played by ESET and Microsoft, if I'm not mistaken, in helping target and understand how to defeat that cyber attack. But the last set of aid that was announced, especially by the US, was to just get the Ukrainians, the common Ukrainian, energy to last through the winter. Is there any conversation in fortifying cyber capabilities and resilience of the energy sector?
Thank you. The answers to this will also be closing remarks because we are in the home stretch. Joshua.
Sure. I'll just say something about cyber. It's very difficult to tell at this stage in the conflict what lessons we should draw about the value of offensive or defensive cyber operations, even though it does seem like it hasn't played as large a role as people expected. I do think it is clear at this stage that electronic warfare has played a more significant role than either side perhaps anticipated. Jamming technologies and other things that have maybe not been quite as top of mind for the United States and other countries in recent years seem to have been quite important. So that is, I think, part of the story that has yet to be told and may not be told for several years, what went on behind the scenes on the cyber side. And when it comes to information propaganda and perception, there will always be various platforms that countries can use for this purpose. There will also be stories to be told about how Ukraine, in the early phases of the war, masked some of its severe deficiencies with really sort of remarkable storytelling across platforms about its successes. And I think we'll all be looking to those stories as examples for how countries that are disadvantaged on the battlefield can make it up in other domains.
Ashley? Since one of the questions was addressed.
Well, I'll address two questions. First, if the NSA was hacked, they wouldn't tell me about it. And, nobody knows what the facts on these things are. But the bottom line is this. There is a strategic collection infrastructure that every modern state has. That is a very important capability that a state brings to bear, both in peacetime and in war. By definition, that network becomes a juicy target for an adversary. And you simply have to operate on the presumption that an adversary is going to want to compromise your ability to collect information, especially information that is militarily relevant to the outcomes. And so, for me, the big investment really has to be in the protection of the network that does the collection, the analysis, and the dissemination. Because if you can protect that network, you give yourself a fighting chance that the kinetic elements of your capabilities can then do the job that they're supposed to do. And this is where I think the challenge for India is going to be very significant in years to come. Because to be very honest, the Chinese have assembled an extraordinary penetration capability at multiple levels, both at the levels of technology and at the levels of human activity. And I think sometimes, because this is something that is abstract and in the background, India focuses on issues of the kit rather than issues of these complementary capabilities that make the kit effective. And so, for my mind, a huge future for US-India cooperation is precisely in the broader areas of how do we create robust enough defenses. Those defenses will be penetrated on occasion. But the good thing about cyber penetrations is that it's very hard to replicate penetrations in a predictable way to get outcomes sort of systematically, which means you have to have adaptability in your system. So there's a lot of work that we can do cooperatively, and I hope we will do that in the future. Second question, the issue of infrastructure attacks. I think that is really important because there are some elements of critical infrastructure, especially, for example, electricity production, that become so critical even in the context of a short war. Now, other forms of infrastructure have an impact depending on how protracted the conflict is. But you cannot find a modern war today if you have your electricity networks physically destroyed, right? So there are some elements that have to be protected either through resilience or simply harder and harder defenses. And so what the Russians were able to do, for example, with missile attacks on the electricity grid, is something that we know technologically how to prevent. But it requires us to build the air defense capabilities, build the missile defense capabilities, and so on and so forth. And I think if you think your critical infrastructure is vulnerable to kinetic attack, then you have to put in a lot more money in the areas of defenses well before the war begins, because this is not something you can fix, in the context of the conflict.
Raj, would you like last thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to, respond to this whole business of emerging technologies. Ashley said that space, cyber, and all these, these are exotic technologies. I would tend to differ. Today, all of these technologies have intimate tactical applications. For example, if we lag in space in the military sense, look at what is happening to revisit times. So the Chinese, with a network of about 300 satellites, all along the LAC, their revisit times are half an hour. Ours are in days. So it affects the company and squadron commander. So we must, in my view, eliminate these restrictions. What is happening in India with all these technologies is that we are paying seminar obeisance and not rolling them out. And if you do not roll them out fast, and the military doesn't begin to see the advantages, they tend to sound esoteric, whereas they are not. For example, AI, let's say, if we were to seriously invest in these stacks of data, compute, algorithm, and engineering, which a lot of people talk about, there will be immediate military payoffs in sensors, in fires, in command and control, logistics, speed. There'll be direct military payoffs. You'll be ahead in the UDA cycle. Now, similarly, cyber. These distinctions that we draw, civil space, military space, countries which have really set up these cyber commands at scale, what is the whole battle? The whole battle, say, between two adversaries is, how does deterrence flow in the cyber domain? That he knows that I'm in his networks, I know that he is in my networks, and therefore we stay off. So there has to be an offensive capacity of that kind. Look at a worst case scenario, how it could manifest. Tomorrow, a crisis along the LAC, and you have two massive attacks on the power grid in, say, Delhi and Mumbai. It's very much a possibility. So my whole point is these distinctions, civil, military, we must drop these phrases, dual use. Because today, the way things are happening, that anything that is kosher in the civil space will find its way into the military space. So we have to look at the pandemic. What started out as a health event, you saw the brutal geopolitics flowing out of it. It became a national security crisis. So these distinctions must go. That does not mean that we be irresponsible. But these distinctions have to go, and we really have to look at this technology lens afresh. Just one last point I want to make. Today both Ashley and Joshua are cautioning me against being enthusiastic about technology. Look at the supreme irony. When I was young, we were told that you fight. You don't think about technology. We didn't think about technology, and we were marginalized in technology. And now, now when the army is getting back to technology, on a lighter note, Ashley is not being very encouraging.
See that this is actually things very difficult. Lauren, you get the last word.
Oh, well, thank you. To speak to that question quickly about the private sector and, the role of private companies, I'll say two things. One, increasingly private companies are going to be called upon to self-regulate or restrict certain features. I know we're seeing this already with more, ethically conscious companies like OpenAI, which is restricting certain functionalities into the red team themselves, and seeing how the potential adversarial uses of some of their capabilities. I think an example, the Biden administration, when it was calling upon a new wave of sanctions a few weeks ago, there were, it wasn't able to put sanctions on software to Russia, but it was calling on, private companies to, opt in on a voluntary basis to do so. So I think increasingly we're going to see more of that. And secondly, I think specifically for lessons from Ukraine, I think early on in the conflict as well, Ukraine was very successful at mobilizing their digital ministry early in the conflict to kind of handle a lot of this technology, handle a lot of the information warfare, and really gain the public on side. And it was also really quick to engage with the private companies as well, and to see things like we saw increased censorship on Twitter, we saw the providing of Starlink satellites. And the shutdown of some other technologies, the cessation of drone sales. commercial drones. And so I think we're going to see more of those happening also in the future. So I'll stop there and try to keep us close to time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And that leaves for me is to say thank you very much to Carnegie and to the audience and to the panelists. This was an absolutely super discussion, and thank you all very much.